or to hear you. Welcome to another wonderful evening studying our Shemona Esrei. And we are tonight going to be looking at the Beracha of Tekah b'Shofar, sound the shofar, the great shofar for our freedom. So this is a fascinating bracha, and we couldn't have a better presenter to share with us in the form of Rebbetzin Lori Palatnik, who is well known to many of us. But before we get to Mrs. Palatnik, just want to make a comment or two about this bracha of Tekah b'Shofar, because it's very interesting. If you look at the middle 13 brachas of the 19, meaning not the standard opening 3 and not the standard closing 3, but the middle 13, which change based on the occasion all week long, they're the same. Shabbos they change, Yom Tov they change. But these middle 13 have a number of brachas that deal with redemption. We have Goel Yisrael, Redeemer of Israel. We have Matzmiach Keren Yeshua. We acknowledge God as the one who sprouts the Yeshua salvation. We have Bnei Yerushalayim, builder of Yerushalayim. So it's really interesting that Chazal, in authoring the Shemona Esrei, decided to break out various aspects of the redemption into different brachos. It's fascinating that they thought that each aspect of the redemption, which would be incomplete without all of them, but each aspect gets its own bracha. So the bracha that we have tonight that we're going to be studying is the one about Tekah b'Shofar Gadol L'Chiroseinu. So just a couple of things to note about it. One is that we close the bracha with Mekabetz Nidchei Amo Yisrael, which is that we say that God, you are the one who gathers up the exiled, the exiled of your people Israel, the ones who are pushed out to the four corners of the world. You gather them up. We don't say the one who will gather them up. One day when Mashiach comes, it will happen, but rather you are doing it now. That means that no matter when Shemona Esrei is offered, at any time since the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the sages who authored the Shemona Esrei, the members of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, felt that it was appropriate to bless Hashem as the one who is gathering up the exiled of the people Israel from all four corners of the world. Can you imagine? You're davening Shemona Esrei in Auschwitz, and you get to this bracha and you say, "Blessed are you, Hashem, Mekabetz Nidchei Amo Yisrael," the one who gathers up, who is gathering up the Nidchei Amo Yisrael, those who are pushed to the extreme four corners of the world. Which means the Chazal are telling us that even though we don't see it, it's happening. It's all part of the plan. It's all of Galus, including the darkest moments, are part of a plan to ultimately bring us back to Eretz Yisrael. And it's not only the physical ingathering, but it's also the spiritual ingathering. That even though we've been pushed to the four corners spiritually of the world, God is also going to be gathering us back. Up until recently, you had to be a real ma'amin. It was a dream. It was a fantastic dream. It was something that was, you almost, even if you believed it was going to happen, it was going to happen in your lifetime. It would only happen during a miraculous era. We are one of the first generations, only a few generations, have had the privilege of offering this bracha while we see it happening. If you think about it, from the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash until maybe 150 years ago, there wasn't on record anything close to the ingathering of Jewish exile. So we're dealing now with a bracha that we almost take for granted when we say, yeah, you're gathering in the exiled Jews from all corners of the world. There are now probably, can't be proven exactly, but if it's not true, it's almost true, more Jews in Israel than the rest of the world, which is just a fantastic sentence. Anybody who knows anything about Jewish history has to have goosebumps just to think about the fact that if it's not true, it's going to happen maybe within the next 5 years. That's how close it is to being true, which is an amazing historical development. And it's something that no generation or very few generations before us have ever had a chance. So tonight we're going to hear from Rebbetzin Lori Palatnik. She probably is known to everybody. She's a household name in the Orthodox world. She is somebody who is literally living this bracha. She is responsible for leading Jewish Women's Renaissance Project, JWRP, which has now been changed to, I think it's called Momentum now. Over 20,000 women, heads of families have been brought to Eretz Yisrael, been inspired to come back and change their lives in some significant Jewish way. Torah study, Shabbos observance, affiliation, involvement in Jewish life, sending children to Jewish day schools in high numbers and high percentages as a result of her leadership. She herself is the story of the Jewish people, not raised in a religious and observant home, discovering her Judaism relatively late in life, becoming a Baal Tshuva, learning at the feet of people who have led the Baal Tshuva movement, turning herself into a transformative power, taking her passion for Yiddishkeit and sharing it with other Jews and literally touching thousands. She and her husband have led shuls. They've led Torah centers, Asia Torah centers, a shul up in Toronto. And by the way, Mrs. Palatnik is also a kidney donor, just to give you another little angle on her kind of passionate commitment to the world. Anyway, we're going to hear from her right now on this bracha of Takaba Shofar, sound the great shofar for our freedom.
Talk about Palatnik. And I'm coming to you from Yerushalayim, from Jerusalem. I'm the founding director of Momentum, which we'll talk about as I share my story with you. Sound the great shofar for our freedom. When do we hear the shofar? Well, we hear it on Rosh Hashanah. The Rambam Maimonides says, when you hear the shofar, you're supposed to be thinking, wake up, you sleepers from your slumber. We're sleeping? Well, you have an alarm clock for your body. The shofar is an alarm clock for your soul. Wake up? Yes, because we're sleepwalking. I grew up in Toronto, classically Jewish. We did Hanukkah, dreidel, dreidel, dreidel. The Passover Seder seemed to get shorter and shorter every year. The joke in Canada, before expansion, it was always during the Stanley Cup playoffs. The national religion in Canada is hockey. So the joke at our Seder was, there wasn't just 4 cups at the Seder. There were 5 cups, the 4 cups of wine and the Stanley Cup. And there weren't 4 questions, there were 5. There were the 4 questions in the Haggadah, and then the 5th question was, what's the score? And we tried to finish our Seder quickly and go down and finish the game. Sound the great shofar for our freedom. Raise the banner to gather our exiles and gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. I went to public school. We called our after-school Hebrew school on Sunday we called it Jew jail. Sunday is Jew jail day. My brothers were told they must go until they're 13 and have their bar mitzvah. But my sister and I were told, you don't have to. When I was 8 years old, I was told, you don't have to go until your bat mitzvah. It's your choice. You can or you don't have to. Your brothers have no choice. That's what my parents told us. So my sister and I are like, we don't have to do this anymore? Yay, we're out of here. And that's when I ended my Jewish education, when I was 8. But here I am, married to a rabbi. And of the 4 kids in our family that I grew up with, 3 of us live very committed Jewish lives. 2 of us live in Israel. 1 lives in Muncie, which some people think is the land of our people. And we're raising our children, and they're raising their children with very strong Jewish commitment and values. What happened? Well, the Almighty sounded a great shofar and got our attention. Mine started, my journey. Well, first my sister had her journey, and I thought she was crazy. I thought she was in a cult. Okay, it's a 3,500-year-old cult, but we thought she was like, if you would have listed all the crazy things that would have happened in my family, this wouldn't have even been on the list. Kosher, Shabbos, like, what? How did my journey begin? Well, I was working in the world of advertising. I was a copywriter, and I won a national award for a Christmas commercial that I wrote. That's right. Jews are very good about Christmas. I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. That's Irving Berlin. The most famous Christmas songs were written by Jews. I'd won a national award for this Christmas commercial, and I decided before I changed markets to a bigger market, I'm going to go see the world. My mother's an artist, and I was raised with a lot of art and culture growing up, and I wanted to see the Mona Lisa. I wanted to see the Statue of David. I wanted to see the Renoir and the Pissarro. So I had my education, my work experience, my award, and I got a backpack and off I went. Under very strange circumstances, I ended up in Israel. That's too long a story to tell. But basically, Hashem was like, you here, over here, we have something to talk about. I ended up in Israel. A couple of weeks into my backpacking around Israel, I started having feelings. I didn't know what they were. At a certain point, I felt, if I don't leave now, I'm never going to leave. I want to live here forever. And it didn't make any sense. So I left. I went back through Europe, and I was writing an article for a Canadian magazine on Canadian women who live abroad. And went back to Canada, moved to Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And I got a job in marketing for McDonald's restaurants. Christmas commercial, McDonald's restaurants, future Rebbitzin. It's a common tale. A year into my work at McDonald's, I got something in the mail from Aisha Torah. Never heard of it before. And it says, Julie Bloom recommends you for the 6-week study and tour, Jerusalem Fellowships in Israel. This was 1985. I'm like, who's Julie Bloom and what is this Jerusalem Fellowships? But it was a chance to go back to Israel. And in the year that I had been back in Canada, I'm sure it was there all along, but it just seemed like every time I turned on the TV, every time I opened up a newspaper, every time everything was about Israel. Everything was about Israel, the Jewish people. And I couldn't get it out of my heart. So here was a chance to go back. So I applied, and I ended up that summer traveling with 120 university, college, post-university and college kids. And they brought us to Israel. The idea is to inspire us to our Jewish identity and to send us back as leaders. About 4 weeks into the 6-week program, I had those feelings again. I felt, if I don't leave now, I'm never going to leave. I want to live here forever. But this time I knew why. Because we've been not just touring, we've been learning, we've been studying. Why? Why did I want to stay? Why did I know why? It had something to do with God. And it had something to do with the destiny of the Jewish people, that we played a role in this world. And I had a lot of questions, and I wanted to know more. So when the 6 weeks were over, most of the kids got back on their planes and did go back to become, many of them, committed Jews and Jewish leaders. I had questions, and I was grappling. Where do I fit into this? Is this really true? Is there a God? Did God give the Torah at Mount Sinai? If he did, what does that mean for my life? I could have easily have gotten on that plane and gone back to my life. I had a very nice life. My friends envied my life. But I couldn't go back on that plane until I had answers. And I asked, and I grappled, and I debated. And my goal was that at the end, that this was not true. Whatever, it's nice to be the Jewish people, bagels, lox, cream cheese, good, good, good. But I was really fine to go back to my life. But darn it, I came to the conclusion that this is true. And I needed to know more. So I never got back on that plane, and I stayed. I stayed for a year, and I studied, and I really tried to find where do I fit in this committed Jewish world, in the world of Torah. I still don't relate to my sister, her life in Muncie, or her friends. I had to find my place. And I started meeting dancers and writers and actors and who had chosen to live very committed Jewish lives. And I found my teachers. And I started an aerobics business because I needed to make money. And then I went back to Toronto after a year was over, and then went back again after the summer to Israel. And a few months later, met my husband, who was a rabbi at Isha Torah. We had planned to live in Israel forever, but God had other plans, and off we went, newly married, newly pregnant, to Toronto. And that's where we spent the first 13 years of our lives, our married lives. We had all our 5 children there, and we built up a community called the Village Shul, which was a wonderful experiment that we started with 5 other families. Nobody was Shomer Shabbat, and it was in the basement of another shul. Then it was in our house, and then it was a storefront in Toronto's Forest Hill. For the first year, we couldn't afford a sign, and the store that was there before was a cheese store, so it said an adventure in cheese. So we were fondly known as Jews for cheeses. But later on, we had a sign. We called it the Village Shul, because everything in Forest Hill is Forest Hill Village. Village Hardware, Village Bakery, so we were the Village Shul. And now it's really an unbelievably thriving community that we had the pleasure of pioneering. It's affected a lot of lives. Time went on, and we moved to the States. We gave our baby, the Village Shul, to another Aish rabbi to run, and we moved to the States. And I started becoming a speaker in the Jewish world. There's a lot of rabbis. There's not a lot of women. And then I would get these crazy job offers because people knew that a community lives and dies by where the women are at. That if you inspire a man, but you're not inspiring his wife, sometimes you create a problem in the home. But if you inspire the wife, you create a solution. So I would come home and tell my husband, do you want to be the chief rabbi of Costa Rica? Comes with maids. He says, I don't speak Spanish. I go, Yaakov, it comes with maids and a driver and a cook. You can learn Spanish. So obviously we're not moving to Costa Rica, and we're not moving to Johannesburg, and we're not moving to LA. But what was I going to do? I just couldn't go to these communities, and I saw them getting weaker and do nothing. So I gathered 7 other women in the Washington, D.C. area, and we went away to Utah. Why Utah? Because one of the 7 women owns a beautiful place in Utah. Ski in, ski out. And I said to them, we're smart women. We need to come up with a home run idea for the Jewish people. And I walked them through a process that businesses go through. And I consulted with somebody before I went away to Utah, where you take an eclectic group of people and you come to a common mission, vision, and purpose. And we came up, even though we were very different. Half of us were Shomer Shabbat, half were not. Half were left Democrat, half were right Republican. This was DC. We're all also at different stages of life. And we decided to focus in on the values that we share, the core values, and to establish, back then it was called the Jewish Women's Renaissance Project, the JWRP. Today it's called Momentum. And we came up with many ideas. 3 floated to the top, and 1 what we do now, which is like a birthright for mothers, that took off like a rocket. The first year we brought 300 women from Canada, United States, and Mexico. Then we brought 600, then we brought 900. Then Israel's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs called us. Who are you? What are you doing? And I went in and passionately presented what we do. I said, let's be partners. They said, double your numbers, get into Eastern Europe, and we'll help back you. So I flew to Moscow, and I flew to Hungary, and I flew to Greece, and I flew to Turkey, and I flew to Cuba. I was everywhere. I used to, before COVID, I used to wake up every morning. I'd ask myself two questions. Number one, where am I? And number two, is it Shabbos? And sometimes, where am I? The answer was, I don't know. We have now brought 20,000 Jewish mothers from 30 countries to Israel. For most of the women, it was their very first time, because we are targeting women who are disconnected from their Jewish identity in the Jewish community. And we do it in partnership with 250 organizations around the world, including Atlanta. And they go back for a 1 year of growth. They come together, they have a profound transformational experience together, and they go back together to support each other. They're coming from the four corners of the earth. And the data shows that this is making real change. Why? I didn't make this up. Our sages teach us that it's in the merit, in the zechut, in the merit of the Jewish women that we were redeemed from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, and it will be in the merit of the Jewish women that the ultimate redemption will happen. Sound the great shofar. The ultimate redemption, that the Jewish people come back from the four corners of the earth, both physically and spiritually. Wherever I go in the world, wherever I speak, I used to always ask them, the leaders of the community, the people who are hosting me, what's the anti-Semitism like here? And they all, they would say, like, for example, in Madrid, it's not good. Oh, but it's worse in France, or it's worse in England. So wherever I went, they would always tell me, it's not good, but it's worse over there. And then they would say to me, but thank God for Israel, because I can always get on a plane. And you know what I used to say to them? Don't you think the planes can stop flying? And then they did. The Almighty got our attention this year, didn't he? He didn't blow a shofar physically, but he definitely woke us up. He brought the whole world to its knees. He put the whole world in a timeout. Why do we put our kids in a timeout? Well, sometimes our kids are fighting. They're bickering. One takes a toy truck, smashes it over his sister's head. So what do? We put him in a timeout. Why? Well, first of all, we want to stop the fight. We also want the perpetrator to think about their actions, their thoughts, and their words. And hopefully after a certain amount of time, they come out and they're hopefully remorseful, they apologize, and they go on to become better people. Does that happen with our kids? Not usually. They come off. We say, okay, now tell your sister you're sorry. And they go, sorry. And the sister goes, that wasn't a real sorry, because it wasn't. Is it going to happen again? You betcha. So we've all been put in a timeout, the whole world, to think about our actions, our thoughts, our words. People keep saying, I just want to go back to the way it was. Let's just go back to normal. If we go back to the way it was, this was for nothing. We have to emerge as better people, committed to making a better world. When we were first in bidud, which means in quarantine, I was in bidud in Israel before it was fashionable. I'd come back, it was the beginning of March, and from one of my travels, and the word went out within 24 hours that anybody who was, the Israel government said, anybody who was at APAC, which is the big pro-Israel conference in DC every year, anybody who was at APAC has to go into bidud if you're in Israel. You have to go into quarantine. Because some people who were at APAC apparently had been exposed, and anyway, it was a whole thing that happened from there. So all my Israeli friends laughing at me, because I'm Canadian. I follow the rules. So I went into bidud. Well, it's a good thing I did. My husband quickly also went into bidud because things escalated in the country. He has not been to a minyan since Purim, because my husband and I are both high risk. My husband is high risk because of his age and also because he has a cardiac history. I'm high risk because 13 years ago, almost to the day, I donated my kidney to a woman I'd never met before, which is a whole different story. It was the greatest experience of my life. But apparently COVID attacks the kidneys. And half the people who get COVID in a serious way are going to have kidney issues, and half of those people are going to need kidneys. And I only have one kidney, so I have to always remember that. So we are high risk. So here we were, and things started shutting down in Israel. And I remember saying to my husband, we live in a neighborhood in Jerusalem, it's called Musrara. It's just outside the old city. It's a very pedestrian, very old historic neighborhood. Eclectic, love it. And a couple of days into the shutdown in Israel, the lockdown, I said to my husband, listen, the birds that, you'd always sort of hear at sunrise were so loud all day long. It was like living in a bird sanctuary. I said, Yaakov, listen to the birds. They're singing all day long. It's like they're singing Shir to Hashem. They're singing a song in glory to the Almighty. Because we stepped back from the world and the world started healing. Remember, like the waters were clear and the animals started coming out and the birds are singing all day long. A few days later, I said to my husband, maybe they were singing all along. We just weren't listening. Because we're running and we're doing Tikah b'shofar. Wake up, you sleepers from your slumber. We're not listening. When I look back at my journey that ultimately brought me back to Hashem and brought me back to Israel, I look back and I see the signs along the way. And there were times the Almighty was trying to get my attention, but I wasn't listening. And just like if you tell your kids who you love so much and only want what's good for them, if you tell them something and they don't listen to you, do you say, well, they got their life, I got mine. I told them, and off I go. Good luck. No. If they don't listen, usually you get louder. Or you make sure that somebody they'll listen to says it. Like sometimes they won't hear it from you because you're the parent, but they will hear it from somebody else. So your job is to get that person to be in touch with your kids. People send me their teenage daughters from all over the world to talk to and to counsel. My own girls, when they were teenagers, Ima, you always say the wrong thing. Ima, you're so embarrassing. Ima, that's so lame. Because I'm their mother. They're not going to hear it from me. So my job was, who will they hear it from? The Almighty loves us so much he's not going to give up on us. And sometimes he gets louder to bring us back from the four corners of the earth. My husband always says, better to get God's message when he whispers, and don't wait for him to shout. On the trips, the momentum trips, the women call it HP, higher power. In Hebrew, you would say hashgacha pratit. That means divine supervision. That life is not luck, and it's not coincidence. Everything happens for a reason. And the HP, the higher power in Israel, God's on sense around. But the Almighty's everywhere. There's just a lot of static outside of Israel. Here, sense around. The Almighty's always sending us messages. Prayer. It's not a one-way conversation. We reach out from our heart, in our own words, and the Almighty does talk back. But if you heard him his voice from a cloud this morning, I'm sure there are therapists in Atlanta who the rabbi can recommend for you. You're not going to hear God's voice in a cloud or from a mountaintop. But when we're taught in Tehillim, in Psalms, that God's voice thunders across the mountains, breaks the cedars of Lebanon, sounds pretty loud. Yes, the Almighty's voice, when I get something in the mail from Aisha Torah that I'd never heard about in my life, from a girl, Julie Bloom, who I hung out with for a couple of days on my many weeks of journey through Europe and Israel, who remembered me and put me on a list. When things happen, they happen for a reason. But are we listening? Sound the great shofar for our freedom. Tikah b'shofar gadol. Raise the banner together, our exiles, and gather us together from the four corners of the earth. Baruch atah Hashem, mekabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, Hashem, who gathers the dispersed of his people, Israel. The Almighty wants us home. Just like when your kids come home. Aren't you the happiest person in the world? Don't you love it? I miss my kids. Even the ones who are local, because of all the lockdown and the COVID and because we're high risk, we can't see them very often. I always say that this time is a combination of Gilligan's Island and the Jetsons. Gilligan's Island because we're shipwrecked. Did you ever play that game? If I had to be shipwrecked on an island, who would I want to be with? Well, you don't have to wonder, because God already decided. This time this year, this is who you're supposed to be shipwrecked with. And there's probably very few people in your home. Compared to your life when you're out in the office and out traveling, my life got very, very small. But it was much easier to hear God's voice. Because we're not running and doing. Because we do have time to think. And you can hear the birds. And you can hear the Almighty's voice whispering in our ear. Come home. Come home. Do you know how many people I know who thought about moving to Israel, and now that Israel closed its borders, now they really want to come? It's good. Don't get comfortable out there. It's not our home. No matter where we lived in the world, we always told our kids, this is not your home. Israel's your home. And I told them, one day Ima and Abba are going to live in Israel, and we hope you live there too. And if you don't, we hope you visit, but that's where we're going. And any community I lived in, I'd always tell them, get out of here. And my husband said I had no credibility because I still lived there, but I felt I was there to sound the shofar. We are guests in the countries outside of Israel. And guests are only as welcome as the host wants them to be. Don't forget, even though you're living in your little Jewish bubble, in your Jewish communities with your wonderful Jewish leaders, and Atlanta's amazing, amazing Jewish community, but you're still guests. So we're waiting for you in every way to come home. And I told wherever I lived, I said, I'm not going alone. I'm taking you with me. And some of them even believed me. And they came too. It's amazing here. It's amazing. I feel so blessed that if I had to be in lockdown, that it's in Eretz Yisrael. But we have to merit the land. Yeah. Whatever it is, you think you're not here because of this or because of that, the Almighty could change all of that to make it work for you here. You have to merit it. You have to want it like crazy. I never gave up for even one day for 32 years that we were going to come back. We're waiting. Please, God, we should all merit to come home in every way. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. So when you come to that bracha in the Shemona Esrei, think about how the Almighty blows the shofar in your life to wake you up. And what does it mean to come home? What does it mean to come back, both physically and spiritually? It might mean something different to you than it does to me. That's good. The Almighty loves us individually. And He never, ever, ever gives up on us. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining tonight. And thank you to Mrs. Palatnik for presenting her story and tying it into the bracha of Tekah b'shofar Gadol L'cheiruseinu. A thank you also to tonight's sponsor. This shir is sponsored in the for the elevation of the soul of Pinchas ben Avraham. So thank you. May his neshama experience an aliyah from the Torah learned tonight and the inspired tefillos and prayers that hopefully come as a result of our spending this time together and studying this bracha, or hearing some imagery that we can attach to the bracha. I want to just end with one quick thought connected to this week's parsha. As I was listening to the words of Mrs. Palatnik, I was reminded there is a medrash, a fascinating medrash in this week's parsha. The medrash refers to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to be buried inside of Eretz Yisrael. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, it was decreed that he wouldn't be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael, but he wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, and his request was denied. And Moshe said, well, how am I different than Yosef HaTzadik? Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef, the leader of the world, really, was Zoche. He merited being buried in Eretz Yisrael. The Atzmos Yosef, the bones of Yosef, were vouchsafed and safeguarded by none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Jewish people kept them and ensured that he was buried in Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu asks, well, why didn't I receive the same treatment? And the Medrash records that Hashem says, Mi shehodeh ba'artzo nikvar ba'artzo. Mi shelo hodeh ba'artzo lo nikvar ba'artzo. And that means is, he who admits, you can also say means gives thanks, but he who readily identifies with his land, he will be buried in his land, and he who does not, will not. Yosef, when he was in prison, he was called an Ish Ivri. He was called a Jew. He was called a Jew from the other side, from Israel. And he admitted it proudly, triumphantly admitted that he was an Ivri. When Moshe Rabbeinu was about to meet his wife, they reported to Yisra, his future father-in-law, that there was an Ish Mitzri, there was an Egyptian man who saved us today. And the Medrash records that Moshe Rabbeinu, on his level, was faulted for that. You shouldn't have said you were allowed yourself to be called an Ish Mitzri, not an Ish Mitzri, not an Egyptian person, you're a Jew. So that's what the Medrash says. That's the difference. Yosef was buried in Egypt because he proudly owned the fact that he was an Ivri, that he was from there, from Eretz Israel. He was a Jew. Moshe Rabbeinu did not merit to be buried in Israel because he didn't protest when he was called an Egyptian. Very interesting. The commentaries ask, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Yosef was actually from Israel, Eretz Israel. That's where he was from. Moshe Rabbeinu was not from Eretz Yisrael. He had never been there. He never went there at all. He was Egyptian. He was born in Egypt. So what is the teviyah? What's the claim on Moshe Rabbeinu? And the answer, I think, is obvious. I believe I saw this somewhere. The answer is that that Moshe Rabbeinu, according to this Medrash, was responsible for not identifying as somebody who belongs and whose roots are really in Eretz Yisrael. He was not an Ish Mitzri, even though he was born, lived, was raised in Egypt. He was not actually an Ish Mitzri. He was a Jew, and a Jew identifies with Eretz Yisrael as being their place. That's a lesson that we can all take. Yes, we take great pride in living in this country, Medina Shel Chesed, the country of kindness, and we have incredible freedoms here, and we're able to have a thriving, rich Jewish life. But we always have to remember that where we really belong, and where we really, the point to which we all really connect. And that's one of the things that we refer to in this bracha when we talk about Hashem should blow the great shofar and gather us all together, really together. In fact, there's one version of the Shemona Esrei in which the word la'artseinu is added. You should gather us together, la'artseinu, to our land. So that's alluded to in the whole bracha. There is a variant version of Shemona Esrei that actually has that word in it. And that is one shade, one aspect of this beautiful bracha that we focused on tonight. And that is connected to this week's parsha. So it's very handy. Anyway, thank you all very, very much for joining. As always, next week, we're in for another treat. Rabbi Yitzchak Breidowitz, who is currently teaching Torah in Israel at Or Sameach. Brilliant scholar, brilliant speaker, extremely erudite, extremely eloquent. And he's going to be presenting on the bracha of din, of mishpat, of judgment. I couldn't think of a better person to present on that bracha because of his incredible scope of Torah knowledge, his very his amazing ability to present, and he's also a judge. He was also a judge and a law professor here in America for his whole career. So that combination is very unique, and we'll be hearing from him next week. Same time, same channel. We'll see you then. Have a wonderful night.